Welcome everyone, Christine here with the discussion about the best melee races in Total War Warhammer 3. I did a poll, I asked people what they thought about what I consider to be the top 5 melee races in Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, and based on that poll, as well as my own perspective, I give you this list. Now I'm mainly sticking with the poll, with one major exception, that I've ranked higher, because it does deserve to be ranked higher than people voted it on. But anyway, let's start with number 5, the Vampire Counts. They got number 4 on the poll. Now, the Vampire Counts are mainly known for their Legendary Lords and Lord choices, but they do actually have a pretty good melee line that really allows those Lords and Heroes and Legendary Lords to do their job in battle, which is to take out enemy leaders, terrorize them, break their lines. At tier 1, you get zombies and skeletal warriors, as well as skeletal spearmen. These are not great units, but they're good chaff. You can just throw them in a battle, they're very cheap and effective, and can maintain very large armies of them. Quantity has a quality of its own, and that's exactly what the zombie, skeletal warriors, and skeletal spearmen do. Unless you're Helm Gorst, in which case your zombies faction-wide are as powerful as tier 2, tier 3, and even above infantry units for some other factions. It is actually quite ridiculous. And even when zombies do encounter some armies that might challenge them, you can always support them with some other units that can do the damage, and they certainly have a good amount of HP, and with Helm Gorst you get significant benefits with them. Still, for all the Legendary Lords for the Vampire Counts, the zombies are a pretty effective unit in battle. Now, you also have the Crypt Ghouls at tier 1, and at tier 2 you have the Crypt Horrors. Not necessarily great units to use in battle, though they do have a decent amount of speed. I would say the Crypt Horrors are worth using, the Crypt Ghouls far less so, I would argue, in the campaign. And then, of course, you do get at tier 3, you do get the Cairn Wraiths, which are pretty crazily powerful, like 55% magical resistance, magical attacks, frostbite, armor-piercing damage, causing terror on the battlefield. And then, of course, you can go all the way up to the Hex Wraiths for just basically the better version of that. Though they're counted as cavalry, I'm not quite sure I would count Cairn Wraiths. Well, Hex Wraiths certainly are. Cairn Wraiths, it's a bit tricky, right, when it comes to that, but they're basically serving the same purpose, though these guys are obviously significantly faster and are riding mounts, but they're kind of effectively the mounted version of this unit. And you do have a bunch of support units to support your melee units. Now, with your main barracks chain, you do get Graveguard and Graveguard with great weapons. Regular Graveguard are great units in battle because they have that silver shield, they have high armor, so they're able to tank a significant amount of damage, especially from ranged units. And they are certainly not sloppy in battle as well, with bonus versus infantry, magical attacks, though their leadership does leave something to be desired. And if there is an issue with the Vampire Counts, with basically their entire army roster, is that their units don't break. They're unbreakable, but when their leadership drops, well, they're not unbreakable, but when their leadership drops, they don't flee, they just start disintegrating, which isn't great, by the way, because you can lose a lot of units, so you can obviously recover from that pretty quickly with the raised end mechanic, as well as some other mechanics the Vampire Counts do have in their faction. The Graveguard with great weapons are just the two-handed version of that. They lose the shield, but they gain, of course, a lot of armor-piercing damage. The way I go with the Vampire Count army, I would get a decent number of Graveguard for soaking damage and Graveguard with great weapons for doing damage. That might be the most effective Doom stack, or crap stack if you want to use that term, for the Vampire Counts early in their campaigns, or even throughout the course of their campaign, supported by a bunch of units like Mortis Engines, Monstrous Units, Cavalry, etc. Now, with the Sinister Cops chain going to the Sepulchre Grove, you of course have Morn Ghouls, and you do have Vargai's Flying Monstrous Infantry. Yes, I am counting Monstrous Infantry as being part of this list because that's exactly what they are. They're monstrous infantry. Cavalry is its own thing. Cavalry is not great in sieges. These guys can be great in sieges. And then, of course, you get the Vargulfs as well. So, a fairly solid roster, though, of course, that isn't necessarily the main power of the faction in battle. It's their lords, heroes, and legendary lords, their magic, some support units, all that, but their melee roster does get the job done, is quite capable, though the problem is the cost. Graveguard with grey weapons, and regular grave guards just are a bit too expensive to be able to afford in a very large number of armies. But you can certainly make a Vampire Count's army work with the combination of zombies, skeletons, and of course Graveguard. That might actually be the best possible option. And you can reduce the cost, I believe, with the Blood Dragon if you get it through the Bloodlines. It's not necessarily what you want to focus on early on in your campaign, but it is something that you can do. You can reduce the upkeep cost, I believe, of Grave Guards with a particular skill upgrade for Blood Dragons over there. So that's the situation with the Vampire Counts. At number 4, we have the Lizardmen. They are a melee-focused faction. They do have some ranged options, but they're mainly a melee-focused faction. Not the cavalry faction, a melee one. So let's look at the Lizardmen in terms of their melee options. At tier 1, they can recruit, obviously, skink cohorts. Not really good units. You shouldn't bother with these. In fact, you shouldn't bother with any of these units. What you want to do in Lizardmen campaigns is you either get red-crested skinks for a better melee option, or you get skink skirmishers if you're with tier 1 settlements. But really, it's from tier 2 onwards that the Lizardmen do gain power. But it is a ridiculous amount of power, so even though they don't have any really good tier 1 options, you're not really going to suffer for that in any of the Lizardmen campaigns. There are other issues in those campaigns. Now, you do get the shock infantry choice of chameleon stalkers who have a precursor weapon that does a lot of damage, but these are basically skirmisher infantry units. The real power of the Lizardmen melee roster isn't found here. Yes, Croxigars can be pretty decent, but Lizardmen can struggle with casualty replenishment, and these guys, yeah, they have a lot of HP, so it can be difficult recovering that HP. The main line for the vast majority of the Lizardmen Legendary Lords, with the exception of Oxyatl, and to an extent Tic-Tac-Toe, is going to be the Saurus. Regular Saurus, and then Saurus with shields. Regular Saurus, pretty good armor, very high leadership, good melee stats, as well as a bonus versus large with the Spear one, or just a pretty solid amount of damage over here. They don't necessarily have the largest number of models, and they don't have the highest amount of armor, but they do get a significant amount of melee benefits when it comes to it, especially if their HP drops below 50%. So if their HP drops, and it's certainly well with just 60 armor as opposed to 90 or 80, they're going to get some significant melee benefits. So these guys are quite capable of holding their own in tier 2. In tier 3, you just get the better versions with a bronze shield so they can block some missile attacks. Mind you, taking down Saurus with range is a lot trickier than one might assume. It's not just based on the armor. These guys are large over here. And then, of course, at tier 4, with the main barracks chain here, the Temple Guard barracks, you get Temple Guard. High armor, still a bronze shield, unfortunately, but high armor piercing, bonus versus large over there, of course. Just a great deal of damage from these guys. Really good leadership. Not necessarily the best melee attack in the world, but pretty good stats overall. Then, of course, there are some other options over here for the dinosaurs, the actual dinosaurs themselves, the Bastiladons, the upgraded versions of those, Stegodons, Troglodons, Carnosaurs. They've got some pretty crazy monsters over here available in their faction. And let's not ignore the massive Dreadsaurian. Like, all of these units, by the way, can be really effective in Siege. Maybe not as effective as some monstrous infantry choices, but certainly the Dreadsaurian and, well, the feral version, of course, can be really, really damn effective when it comes to the melee choices over your faction. You can get an upkeep benefit, by the way, with Saurus, but it's really going to be mainly Saurus that you're going to use. The dinosaur units, yeah, they can be pretty effective, but right now I'd say if you're playing the vast majority of Legendary Lords in a Lizardman campaign, you're getting Saurus. And then you might get some dinosaurs to support you. It is a pretty good and effective army. The only thing that's going to hold you back in a Lizardman campaign with that army is the lack of casualty replenishment, because because your baseline casualty replenishment is low. You can get it to a pretty good level, because unlike a race like the dwarves, which aren't on this list, you actually do get a casualty replenishment hero through the Skink Chief. Though unfortunately, fortunately, you can increase the hero capacity to tier 3, so that is a benefit. But you might struggle in the first few turns until you start pumping out Skink Chiefs for every single one of your armies. And those armies, by the way, can be a bit expensive, because regular Saurus are 188 upkeep. One of the problems the Lizardmen have in their campaigns is just maintaining a large number of units. It's not quite Graveguard level, but it's still an issue that they're going to be dealing with during the course of their campaign. At number 3, we have the Greenskins, of course, though their melee units will start coming into play at tier 2, not at tier 1, because the Orc Boys just aren't great units. Yes, 30 armor with the Bronze Shield can seem decent, but they just don't have the stats to be effective in battle, too weak stats, too little damage. You're much better off at tier 1 to just pump out Goblin Archers and just use their range damage to make that effective. So like the Lizardmen, your roster only starts becoming effective at tier 2, though the Greenskins have amazing growth, so that isn't really going to be a problem for you, and their structures early on cost very, very, very little compared to many other factions. It's at tier 2 with the King and the Warlord DLC that you get the Nasty Skulkers, and these guys are incredibly powerful. First off, the vast majority of the Nasty Skulker damage is going to be armor-piercing damage. So these guys can punch way above their weight against heavily armored units. They don't necessarily have the best leadership or armor, but here's the thing. They have a good amount of melee attack, a pretty decent melee defense, and you can buff these guys through the roof. Through scrap upgrades, as well as various other upgrades they can get very quickly during the course of your campaign. So Gobby Gobbos, use them for the 7 armor in particular, as well as this particular upgrade for melee attack. So those Nasty Skulkers, it's not about their base stats, it's the kind of stats you're actually going to have during the course of the campaign. A few other races can take a unit that might seem weak on the surface level and make them significantly more powerful. On top of that, the Nasty Skulkers do gain a significant amount of armor-piercing benefit on top of the one they already have, and melee attack when engaged in melee. They've got Vanguard deployment, they stalk, so range units are going to have trouble detecting them before they engage them in a fight, and they also have an anti-cavalry ability because they can basically stop a charge dead in its tracks by using the Smoke Bomb ability, which reduces speed and charge speed of enemies. They can also chase down after enemies using this ability very effectively, and that's a tier 2 unit. But it doesn't stop there at tier 2. You also have the Trolls. Yes, Trolls have low leadership, but they do have a decent amount of armor, and these guys hit hard. High amount of armor piercing, a good ability of causing fear, being able to replenish combat. Yes, they're vulnerable to fire, but they also have the Siege Attacker trait. This is important for secondary armors, tertiary armies, basically secondary armies throughout the course of your campaign to be able to just take a settlement the moment you reach it. So regular Trolls can be very effective. It's at tier 3 that things get even more insane with Trolls, because you replace your regular Trolls with Stone Trolls. Stone Trolls take 2 turns to recruit. They're a bit expensive at 275 upkeep, but they're still really effective units in a battle, and let me tell you, as Greenskins, you're not going to struggle for money. I wouldn't necessarily make a doom stack of these. I think you can really make a very effective Greenskin army with a majority of your army being made up of Nasty Skulkers and Goblin Archers, and then getting like 4 units or so of Stone Trolls. And these guys will be the siege breakers of your faction throughout the entirety of campaign. They have 25% missile resistance, spell resistance, they cause fear, they have regeneration, and they have the Siege Attacker trait. And they also have 70 armor, which is certainly a really good amount of armor. River Trolls, not so useful. They just have lower armor, though they do have their own benefits at reducing melee attack. I just personally find Stone Trolls to be much, much more effective to actually use in a battle. Then, of course, you do get the Giants, but Giants, not necessarily so great, I would say, in melee, though at tier 5, you do get the Rogue Idols. Now, these guys are absolutely insane. Let me just say this. You never want to face a Rogue Idol in a melee fight with any other melee unit. It's suicide. It's just plain suicide. Between the very high amount of damage, bonus versus infantry, the high level of armor piercing damage, their incredible high level of durability because they have 150 armor, they get more armor piercing damage if it starts losing HP, though of course it's going to start losing some of the armor. They have 15% missile resistance, leadership benefit, just ridiculous levels of power when it comes to this particular unit, and they're unbreakable, which actually does work out very well for them because they're too slow to run away from a battle. So these guys will fight until the end, and they might take everyone down with them when they go down, if they go down. I don't think I've actually faced a Rogue Idol in any campaign I've played, because I generally tend to win my campaigns before enemies can get settlements to tier 5 quickly enough. You do have some other good choices of melee units, of course. You do have the Savage Orcs, which don't have any armor whatsoever. I can show them here. I need the Savage Orc settlement. But you do have the Savage Orcs available, which have no armor, but have some really crazy melee stats and good charge benefits. You do have the Orc Big Guns, which are a much better version than the Orc Boys, with pretty decent armor, good leadership, pretty decent stats overall, but it's really the Black Orcs that take the cake. High levels of armor, high level of damage, armor-piercing damage, great leadership available to them as well. The other units, like the Night Goblin Fanatics, or the Night Goblins in general, I would not necessarily use them, but you do have some really great choices of melee units, from the Nasty Skulkers to the Black Orcs, Big Guns to a certain extent, though I personally never switch from Nasty Skulkers to Big Guns. I don't think it's necessarily worth it. I'd much rather use Nasty Skulkers with some Trolls to get a much better army overall. And then if I really want some significant melee power in my campaign, I can get a bunch of Black Orcs. Pretty expensive, of course, but again, the Greenskins have the economy for it. By the time you get to the ability to recruit Black Orcs at tier 4, you certainly will have enough money to get a significant number of them during the course of your campaign. The Greenskins also have some very significant melee buffs for all their units, between their magic, their skill tree, just a ridiculously powerful race when it comes to melee. Not the best, but certainly one of the top tier melee factions, where both your range is really good, but not top tier. It's pretty decent, it will get the job done, and you can mass them in numbers, and very few other factions can, and your melee can just slaughter everything en masse. Very few units can actually stand up to a stack of Nasty Skulkers with the Goblin Titan full upgrades on these guys. They're just crazy powerful at the moment in the campaign. And number 2, in a race that people voted at number 5 with, what, 2% of the votes on the poll, it is the Wood Elves. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be confused on this, because they'll think the Wood Elves are a range-centric race. What the hell are they doing on the melee list? Well, the Wood Elves have never been a purely range-centric race. The High Elves are a more range-centric race than the Wood Elves have ever been. Since day one, the Wood Elves have always been a versatile race. The only thing they're lacking in their roster is actually artillery, but they have answers to that as well. Or rather, they have a solution. A melee solution. See, the problem with a range-centric army is, while yes, the Wood Elves have some incredibly powerful ranged units, from their infantry to the skirmisher cav, ranged is not great in dealing with sieges. Now, you may not face a lot of siege battles in a campaign, but you do have the ability of having a really powerful field army with no ranged whatsoever. In fact, you can play any Wood Elven campaign without ever recruiting ranged in your armies, or to a very limited extent, and it might actually work out better than a ranged army. Let me just say this, in Orion's current broken campaign where you can get 0% upkeep, you don't spam ranged units. You get melee units. Some very specific melee units. Now, let's take a look at the Wood Elven roster. At tier 1, yeah, you only will want to get Glade Guard. The Eternal Guard is not worth it. Now, at tier 2, the War Dancers, not really great units, to be honest, in a lot of ways. Low armor, pretty good leadership, some pretty good melee stats, but that low armor is going to screw them over. Unlike Nasty Skulkers, Nasty Skulkers can actually get quite a bit more armor than these guys. Though, obviously, these guys would decimate them in melee, but it's not these guys that make it work. At tier 3, we get Blade Singers. Still low armor, but these guys are a bit insane. Very high level of armor piercing, very high level of bonus versus infantry, very high leadership, magical attacks. People ask me why the dwarves aren't on this list. The Blade Singers can annihilate any dwarven unit in a 1v1 fight. Any melee unit. In fact, they might take an entire stack of dwarven units on their own, or quite a lot of them on their own. Like a single unit would probably defeat 3 hammers or something like along those lines. The dwarves are a ranged race, but they have too many issues anyway. And you then get, of course, the Wild Wood Rangers, which aren't quite as insane, but still fairly capable in their own right. Pretty good stats, though they do lack that insane level, that insane bonus versus infantry, but pretty decent armor. But these units, these melee units, ignore them. They might as well not exist. These are not the melee units you're ever going to use in a campaign. You should never recruit these melee units in any Wood Elven campaign. Doesn't matter which one we're talking about. They're not bad, far from it. But when we're talking about melee units for the Wood Elves, you might as well throw these guys in the dirt. No, it's their tree spirit line that is what really makes them effective. Now, if you're playing as Dryka, you can get these this structure here at tier 2 as opposed to tier 3. I believe this also applies for Durfo. By the way, at tier 3, you get some absolutely insane melee units. The Dryads, yeah, they're pretty decent. High levels of pretty decent high level of armor. Basically, the Saurus of the Wood Elves. Decent, not too great, but we'll get the job done. Still better than any other unit that you might get over here. I would say because of that high level of armor, and they can cause fear, and they have some pretty decent stats as well. But it's not the Dryads. I would almost never bother recruiting Dryads in a Wood Elven campaign. No, it's a tier 3 or tier 2, dependent on which campaign you're talking about, that you start getting into the real power of the Wood Elves. It's just one unit, I know. But that one unit is one of the most ridiculously overpowered units currently in any campaign in the game, especially if you're playing Dryka or Durfu. Dryka gets these guys with Frenzy in melee. The others will just get the regular ones, but even the regular ones are absolutely insane. The Tree Spirits of Athaloran, the Treekin of Athaloran. Also known as the most overpowered broken infantry unit in the entire fucking game at the moment. You think Trolls are powerful? You think Warriors of Chaos are powerful? You think Scarbrand is powerful? Let me introduce to the guys who are basically unbreakable because of their leadership, insane levels of armor, magical attacks, ridiculous levels of weapon strength, not necessarily the best armor piercing in the world, but still will certainly get the job done, can cause fear in battle, have a 15% missile resistance, have a 20% physical resistance on them by default, charge defense against large, and they're obviously weak to fire. Like, if you want to deal with the Treekin, you bring fire, but not everyone has access to fire. But it gets even more insane when we're talking about these guys, because you have, as every Wood Elven Legendary Lord, the Ancient Treeman. Now, here's what the Ancient Treeman does. He gives them 20% ward save. Yeah, that is insane. If you're playing a Wood Elven campaign, other lords you might recruit to put in offices, because as Orion, for instance, you can't put these guys in offices, but the guys you want leading your main armies are these guys. That 20% ward save, like Dryka has, and I believe Durfu has as well, is absurd. 20% ward save on a unit that's extremely overpowered to begin with. Let's not even talk about what Dryka and Durfu can do, because they can buff their armor as well. And there's also some more benefits, missile resistance, some significant benefits over here in the research tree that just makes them even more ridiculous. That's what we're talking about here with the Wood Elves. That's why they're on this list. Like, without this unit, they would not be on this list. This unit is insane. In fact, this unit is so insane that when I've talked about a lot of campaign guides, one of the things I've said over and over and over again with Dryka's campaign is I've basically told people, if you meet Dryka, fuck off, more or less. She is not an army you can defeat in a straight up fight, because her entire army is going to be made out of Dryads, Treekin, Treemen, or Forest Spirits, all of which will have fear, all of which will break your morale, and they're very difficult to kill. They're not easy to kill in melee. They're not easy to kill in ranged. You just bring monumental levels of armies to deal with them. If I'm playing as Grom, for instance, you know what the only thing that's going to keep me concerned throughout the entire campaign is? It's not Alfarian or the hippie elves over here in Ulthuan. It's the fact that I start close enough to Durfu that he might just throw an entire stack of Treekin down my throat. And I don't have an easy answer to that, by the way, as the Greenskins, as Grom. Just think on that for a single moment over here. That is a biblical level of power. Oh, and if you think we're over, no. You think get the Treemen at the higher tier, and these guys are also pretty insane. Not quite the same level of insanity, but still pretty ridiculous. Now, the Tree Spirits do have Siege Attacker, of course. They have Charge Defense. They have that physical resistance, missile resistance. The Treemen just cause terror, not just fear, but terror. It is brilliant, and the stats are even more bananas. So whereas Treekin may not have necessarily the best armor piercing, you can buff that, by the way, if you're playing Durfu and Dryka, the Treemen do, and they have magical attacks. No joke, I'm not exaggerating in any way. Anyone who's seen it in action, anyone who's played on it will tell you this. Dryka's army is flat out the most powerful army in the game at the moment in a campaign. That's because she takes these units, buffs them, and then gives them significant benefits for individual upgrades like the scrap mechanic of the Greenskins. Like, if we're talking about just individual legendary lords and campaigns, Dryka is actually the most powerful melee lord in the entire game. Fuck Valkia and Scarbrand. Like, I'll take Dryka's army any single day against anything Scarbrand and Val can throw, and I'd win that particular battle. That's just the situation. It is a bit insane that one of the most powerful range races, or the most powerful range race in the entire game, also is one of the most powerful melee races in the entire game as well. But that's what we get with the Wood Elves when we're talking about creative assembly. Do they need a nerf? Honestly, I don't know how to say it. Like, the thing is, these Treekin can be a bit expensive, of course, but even a couple of them in a single army it's insane, the impact they can have. Like, these guys, like 3-4 units, can win battles against overwhelming odds that you should lose. Your entire army might be routed. I've had this situation. I was playing a campaign as the Sisters. I was about to lose a battle. My entire army was dead or routing, and 3 Treekin units stood their ground and annihilated the entire army they were up against. It is ridiculous what these guys can do. You need to see it to believe it, is all I'm going to say on the subject. And of course, at number 1, with an overwhelming advantage in the polls, we get the Warriors of Chaos, one of the most broken and overpowered races currently in the game, with relatively easy campaigns. You want to know how the Warriors of Chaos earned their number 1 spot? Let's just take out the unit roster that Arcan has to work with. Yeah, this is insane, and the vast majority, over 90% of these units, are melee units. They're not, like, there are obviously a lot of cavalry units, chariot units, but when you're looking at the infantry side of things, it is a bit ridiculous. Now, obviously, these are variants of the same unit, but you do have a lot of power over here. Like your regular Marauders, yeah, pretty weak and effective, but then you get Khorne Marauders or Nurgle Marauders. Things do start getting a little bit better, or Slaanesh Marauders for speed. Then you get Marauders with great weapons for more power, or Marauders of Nurgle with great weapons for more power, more armor piercing when it comes to that. Or dual weapons with Khorne. And by the way, Khorne gets that extra armor bonus, so that makes them far more effective. Then you go into the Warriors of Chaos, which is something that you can achieve very, very quickly in a campaign. And you get your regular Chaos Warriors. You look at these guys, they have 100 armor, good leadership, not necessarily the best melee stats, but these are the shielded version with the silver shield. You, of course, have to look at the Chaos Warriors with great weapons that do a significantly higher amount of armor-piercing damage. The Halberd's kind of useless in a lot of ways because you're not really going to struggle against cavalry charges as the Warriors of Chaos in a campaign setting, but they are still pretty decent when it comes to it. Maybe a couple of them, 1 or 2 of them in an army, or none at all. Then, of course, you have the dedicated ones with the various gods, like the Khorne ones with Frenzy. And those are just Chaos Warriors. By the way, Chaos Warriors themselves as like, what, tier 3 unit, tier 2 unit, you could consider them as either of them. Given the upgrade system, I would probably consider them a tier 2 unit. But the Warriors of Chaos themselves, the Chaos Warriors themselves, are pretty damn crazy. Scarbrand with an army of Chaos Warriors can conquer the fucking world. That's how crazy these guys are. And you might want to get these guys. Then, of course, you do have the various variants, the upgraded versions. In particular, I do obviously like the Chaos Warriors of Nurgle, just because they have an insane level of durability and poison attacks. So yeah, lots of power over there when we're talking about these guys. Or the dual weapons of Khorne, which have that bonus versus infantry, as well as just a decent amount of armor piercing and pretty good armor. And then at the highest level, you get Aspiring Champions. Aspiring Champions, if you get the entirety of your research tree done, are significantly powerful than their base stats suggest. Like, they're only 16 units, but they do get a good amount of armor. They get a ridiculous level of upgrades for the research tree. And eventually, they just become so powerful, you just take a full stack of them and you will never lose a battle. Or you can go with Chosen. Chosen, higher armor, great melee stats, and of course, Chosen with halberds. And then moving on to like the best melee infantry in the game, or one of the best melee infantry in the game, is of course Chosen with great weapons. But we don't stop there, no, because this is just part of their infantry roster. We also have the extended roster. This is only available in the campaign on multiplayer. But in extended roster, you get Bloodletters, which are also ridiculously powerful. The other units I would not necessarily bother with, but Bloodletters are really effective. Or if you're playing Be'lakor, you can upgrade these guys to Exalted Bloodletters. Arcan doesn't get this ability, only Be'lakor does, but you can upgrade them faction-wide to Exalted version, so getting more armor, getting better stats. These guys, even as a baseline, are pretty damn good in melee. Not so great against range, they just lack the armor, so they'll take a lot of damage, and out-resolve, they'll take a lot of damage from range units, but they're very, very effective in melee. In fact, because of their very high level of armor piercing, the bonus versus infantry, their magical attacks, they can be ridiculous. But that's not all, because we're not done here with the Warriors of Chaos. It's a bit insane what you have available in this faction. But that's not all. You also get with Khorne, Bloodthirsters. You know all those powerful demonic units? Yeah, the Warriors of Chaos have them. So Bloodthirsters, Great Unclean Ones, Regiments of Renown, Khorne's Bloody Fist. Absolutely insane. So you get, as the Warrior of Chaos, the most important and powerful demonic units, Keeper of Secrets, dependent on which Legendary Lord you're playing, but all of them will have a really powerful melee roster. It doesn't matter who you're playing. I'd probably say Valkia has a really powerful, of the dedicated ones, Valkia and Festus have the best ones. Festus probably the very best one, but he doesn't hold a candle to Valkia's just combat ability, though Festus does have the plagues with all the implications therein. So a great deal of power over here. You have a choice between significant combat powers or units that are very, very durable, or just the generic version. The generic version of the Chosen Grey Weapons are actually one of the best units. Like, they're only beaten by the Chosen of Nurgle with Grey Weapons, which are just slightly better when it comes to that, just because of the HP situation. Lower speed, sure, but it doesn't matter with Chosen. You just throw these guys in a meat grinder. And of course, you do get Chaos Spawn as well. You can also get Chaos Spawn during the course of a campaign. And Chaos Spawn can be pretty effective melee units as well. The Chaos Spawn basically are your version of trolls, or if you want to talk about the Treekin, though they don't hold a candle against Treekin, I would argue, in a fight. That is my particular perspective. Can be pretty good though, because they are unbreakable, but yeah, not quite as powerful as what the Treekin can offer in the campaign. By the way, if you're worshipping Siege, you're going to have barrier on your units. Imagine some really durable melee infantry units with barrier. And also, let's not ignore some other choices as well. Forsaken are a pretty good melee infantry as well. They have really good armor, good leadership, pretty decent stats. They can get the job done. Only a handful of units only a handful of models in a unit, but still pretty damn effective. If you're playing a campaign like Nokari, Forsaken are really your choice. Forsaken of Slaanesh are really your choice that you want to go for, because they do have a good amount of combat potential over there. And that's my list. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.